Imagine the scene unfolding before you. You're a Persian surgeon standing in the bloody chaos following the first brutal day of combat at Thermopylae. You're studying the lifeless form of a Greek soldier. Not one of those distinguished by the famed crimson cloak, but a man of coarser build, undeniably broader and hardier. You carefully cut open his travel pouch, half expecting to discover precious gold or perhaps a portion of wine rations. To your surprise, your fingers close around a mere handful of hard, bitter acorns. A chill runs down your spine. In the refined society of 480 BC, acorns are widely known as fodder for swine, certainly not for human consumption. Yet, the formidable man stretched out on your examination slab did not succumb to starvation. On the contrary, he perished in battle, fighting with the untamed ferocity of a cornered beast. You have just come face to face with a balanophagos, an acorn eater. This was the rather contemptuous moniker the sophisticated city-dwelling Greeks had bestowed upon the rugged people of Arcadia. And at this very moment, thousands of these very pig-eaters stand resolutely on the opposite side of the formidable wall, their guttural screams echoing, thirsting for your blood. History, as it is often recounted, has sold us a compelling but ultimately deceptive narrative about a pristine suicide squad of 300 superhuman Spartan warriors. The grim truth, however, paints a picture of a gritty, multicultural meat grinder, a brutal crucible where the defensive line was maintained not solely by the renowned Spartan discipline, but significantly by the desperate, savage hunger and sheer will of the Arcadians. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Let us now peel back the layers of the Hollywood filter, which so often distorts historical reality. When we broaden our perspective beyond the narrow, spotlighted focus on King Leonidas and his elite royal guard, the battlefield of Thermopylae instantly transforms from what seems like a contained duel into a sprawling, massively congested brawl. This strategic mountain pass, famously known as the Hot Gates, was far more than a mere stage for demonstrating Spartan vanity. It functioned as a crucial logistical bottleneck, teeming with nearly 7,000 Greek defenders. 7,000. This substantial number utterly redefines the narrative, transforming what is often portrayed as a desperate suicide mission into a genuinely legitimate and formidable tactical blockade. While popular culture frequently obsesses over the iconic 300 Spartans, it conveniently, and perhaps negligently, overlooks the approximately 2,120 Arcadians who stood steadfastly shoulder to shoulder alongside them. For every single crimson-clad Spartan you might envision in that battle line, there were, in fact, 7 men hailing from the rugged highlands of Tegea, Mantinia, and Orchomenus. Why, then, is this numerical detail so critical? Because a phalanx is not merely an assembly of individual warriors. It is, fundamentally, a unified shove. It operates like a complex physics equation involving raw mass, crucial friction, and immense pressure. 300 men, regardless of their elite training or prowess, possess a strictly finite amount of physical mass. When pitted against a Persian force numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a defensive line comprising only 300 would be as insubstantial as paper. They would inevitably be trampled underfoot, skillfully flanked, or simply overwhelmed and pushed backward by the sheer kinetic energy of the vast opposing multitude. To effectively hold such a vital pass, Leonidas desperately needed ballast. He required a heavy, immovable weight to firmly anchor his battle line. The Arcadians, with their inherent sturdiness, provided precisely that crucial anchor. Their very geography had sculpted these men into the quintessential defensive weapon. Sparta, by contrast, lies nestled in a fertile valley, open to approach and famously arrogant in its demeanor. Arcadia, however, is a natural fortress, characterized by imposing limestone peaks and dense, wolf-infested forests, strategically positioned in the heart of the Peloponnese. The ancient Greeks themselves held the belief that the Arcadians were even older than the moon itself, referring to them as the Proselenes, or pre-moon people. While the Spartans dedicated their days to ritualistically oiling their bodies and practicing precise, synchronized drills, the Arcadians spent their lives traversing treacherous vertical slopes, herding resilient goats, and frequently battling fierce bears for survival. Their legs were literally built of iron sinews and cords, honed by ceaseless activity. Their lungs, naturally acclimated to the crisp, thin mountain air, possessed remarkable endurance. When the urgent call to arms echoed through their mountains in 480 BC, these Highlanders did not march forth seeking glory or conquest. They marched because the very survival of their rocky homeland depended entirely on stopping the formidable Persian juggernaut at the pass. Yet their presence within the Greek camp created a fascinating and often tense dynamic. You had the Spartans, the self-proclaimed aristocrats of warfare, armed with the finest state-sponsored bronze weaponry, fighting alongside men who often could not afford a full suit of armor. These were men who, at times, had to supplement their meager rations with acorns. This profound class divide forms the invisible, yet ever-present, thread running through the entire Thermopylae story. The Spartans were there to lead, to command; the Arcadians were there to work, to endure. When the diverse Greek coalition arrived at the pass, they discovered the ancient Phocian wall in ruins, a dilapidated remnant. Who, do you suppose, undertook the arduous task of rebuilding it? Leonidas and his royal guard likely did not deign to lower themselves to hauling heavy limestone. That backbreaking labor fell squarely to the common soldiers, the Arcadians and other allies, who painstakingly stacked the rocks that would ultimately save their collective lives. Erasing the Arcadians from history does far more than just skew the numbers. It fundamentally insults the very nature of Greek resistance. It implicitly suggests that courage is the exclusive property of the elite, the privileged few. But the truth is far more compelling and deeply inspiring. The defense of Thermopylae was a patchwork effort, a fragile alliance held together by sheer spit, relentless grit, and absolute necessity. The acorn eaters did not have the luxury of a death wish or a glorious last stand. They fought because they absolutely had to. And as we will soon witness, when the brutal killing began, they did not cower or hide behind the Spartans. They stood fiercely right next to them, trading devastating blows with the Immortals, their invaluable contributions lost to the annals of time largely because they lacked the sophisticated PR machine that Sparta wielded so effectively. We are going to walk through the fire with them. We will see the battle through their eyes, smell the putrid rot of the battlefield, and finally understand why. For centuries, the world forgot the ordinary men who truly held the line. To truly grasp why the line held at Thermopylae, you must first comprehend the men standing next to the Spartans. You have to consider their origins. If you examine a topographical map of the Peloponnese, you will immediately notice a massive, jagged claw of limestone tearing through the center of the peninsula. This, precisely, is Arcadia. While Sparta luxuriated in the fertile Eurotas Valley and Athens looked outward to the vast sea, Arcadia was landlocked, relentlessly mountainous, and incredibly harsh. It was essentially the Switzerland of ancient Greece, but without any pretense of neutrality or, indeed, the banks. The Greeks had a poignant saying, "If you need a war, buy an Arcadian." For centuries, the primary export of this rugged region was not olive oil, fine wine, or exquisite pottery. It was violence itself. The Arcadian economy ran on the blood and martial prowess of its young men. Because the rocky, unforgiving soil could barely sustain its burgeoning population, the surplus of Arcadian youth left their villages to serve as highly sought-after mercenaries for anyone with enough silver to pay them. They fought for tyrants in Sicily, for satraps in Asia Minor, and even, at times, for the enemies of Greece. They were widely considered the premier hired guns of antiquity, renowned for their grim professionalism and an extraordinary ability to endure hardships that would break any ordinary land soldier. This profound mercenary tradition is what makes their presence at Thermopylae so utterly extraordinary. When Leonidas put out his urgent call for aid, the Arcadians did not demand their standard wage. There were no contracts signed, no looting rights explicitly promised. For a people who traditionally viewed war as a transactional business, this represented a fundamental shift in their entire worldview. They marched north not for financial profit, but because they instinctively understood the terrifying concept of extinction. The Persian threat was not a standard border dispute to be settled. It was an overwhelming flood that would drown their beloved mountains just as easily as it would the fertile valleys. Leading this formidable contingent were the hoplites from Tegea and Mantinea. These two cities were the veritable heavyweights of Arcadia, and they harbored a mutual hatred for each other with a passion that usually eclipsed their animosity for outsiders. In any other year, Tegeans and Mantineans would be actively killing each other over grazing rights or disputed border stones. Yet, at the hot gates, they stood united in the same shield wall. The Tegeans, numbering 500, took their positions with a discernible chip on their shoulder. They possessed a long, bloody history of fighting Sparta to a complete standstill, a remarkable feat few other Greeks could honestly claim. They did not fear Leonidas. They respected him only as a peer, an equal in martial skill. Then there were the Mantineans, another 500 strong, constantly striving to outdo their Tegean rivals in every possible way. This intense internal rivalry within the Arcadian ranks ironically created a deadly competition for valor. Neither group could afford to appear weak in front of the other, and certainly not in front of the formidable Spartans. It transformed the brutal battlefield into a grim contest of courage, where the ultimate prize was not gold or plunder, but undeniable bragging rights. Culturally, these men were distinct from the majority of the Greek coalition. They proudly called themselves proselynes, a bold claim that they had inhabited their mountains since before the moon itself first rose in the night sky. Their mythology was not filled with the polite, marble-columned order of Athens. It was wild, untamed. They traced their lineage back to Arcas, the son of Callisto, who, in their legends, was transformed into a bear. They were, truly, the people of the bear. This earthy, primal nature was clearly reflected in their methods of warfare. Ancient Greek warfare tactics typically relied heavily on rigid formations and unwavering discipline. The Spartans, famously, perfected this mechanical precision. The Arcadians, however, brought a distinctly different flavor to the phalanx. They brought the raw aggression and cunning of the ambush. Living in fractured, vertical terrain meant they were intimately accustomed to swift skirmishes, fighting on uneven ground, and engaging in brutal close-quarters grappling. While a Spartan might strictly hold his assigned position without deviation, an Arcadian might be more inclined to surge forward, driven by a raw, mountainous aggression. Their patron god was Pan, the goat-legged deity of the wild. Pan was not a god of strategic warfare like Athena. He was, famously, the god of panic, the sudden, irrational fear that grips a lonely traveler in the deep woods or a soldier in the chaotic heat of battle. The Arcadians quite literally worshipped the chaos of nature. When they marched to Thermopylae, they brought this chaotic, untamed energy with them. Imagine the stark contrast in the camp. On one side, you have the Spartans meticulously combing their long hair and performing calisthenics in chilling silence. On the other, you have 2,000 Arcadians, rough-hewn men, speaking a thick, guttural hill country dialect, sharpening weapons that had already seen brutal service in a dozen different foreign wars. They likely looked at the Spartans, not with awe or reverence, but with the cynical eye of seasoned professional contractors observing a new client. They knew the grim business of killing better than anyone. But there was a fundamental logistical reality that bound them together. The Arcadians were heavy infantry equipped as hoplites. They carried the aspes, the large, round shield, and the dory, the thrusting spear. However, unlike the uniform, standardized equipment of the Spartan elite, the Arcadian gear was a motley collection. A helmet might be a Corinthian style passed down for 3 generations. A breastplate might be woven linen instead of gleaming bronze. This lack of uniformity did not matter when the lines physically crashed together. What mattered profoundly was the sheer weight. We often discuss the phalanx as an abstract concept, but physically, it demands men to lean intensely into the backs of the men in front of them, driving the entire formation forward like a relentless rugby scrum. The Arcadians, with their formidable physical strength, provided the essential horsepower. With over 2,000 men, they formed a column deep enough to absorb the shock of the ferocious Persian charge. Without the Arcadians, the Spartan line would have been too shallow, too insubstantial, to effectively function. The sheer physics of the battle relied critically on the muscle mass of these indomitable Highlanders. Leonidas knew this. He did not bring them along as mere spectators. He brought them because he desperately needed the bear to guard his flanks. He needed the men who had traditionally turned war into an industry to now turn it into a desperate defense of Western civilization itself. And the Arcadians, putting aside their traditional greed for gold and their deep-seated hatred for each other, tightened their shield straps and prepared to do the one thing they were best at, bleed for a cause. Only this time, the cause was unequivocally their own. By the spring of 480 BC, the world as they knew it was ending. This was not a vague prophecy or an abstract threat. It was a visible, creeping reality manifesting from the east. Xerxes, the formidable king of kings, had launched the largest invasion force in recorded human history. Herodotus claims the Persian army literally drank rivers dry as they marched. Even if we strip away the obvious exaggeration, the scale of the Persian wars had dramatically shifted from a punitive expedition to a full-blown colonization event. The terrifying message was clear: submit or burn. Greece was paralyzed by fear. The Oracle of Delphi was spitting out doom-laden verses, telling the Athenians to flee and the Spartans that their king must die. Panic was the prevailing currency of the day. In this pervasive atmosphere of terror, the Greek city-states gathered at the Isthmus of Corinth to desperately figure out how to stop the looming apocalypse. The logic was elegantly simple. They needed to find a choke point. They needed a cork to plug the metaphorical bottle. Thermopylae was that cork. But knowing where to fight was easy. Finding the men willing to do it was the monumental problem. This brings us to the Spartan complication. When the urgent call to arms went out, Sparta was in the middle of the Carnea, a sacred religious festival honoring Apollo. Spartan law was rigid, unbending, no military campaigns during the Carnea. To march to war was to invite divine wrath and catastrophe. It was the ultimate bureaucratic excuse. The Spartan council, the ephors, were hesitant to commit their full army, fearing a slave revolt at home as much as the Persians abroad. Leonidas, however, understood with chilling clarity that the Persians did not care about the Spartan liturgical calendar. He knew that if Thermopylae fell before the festival ended, the war was effectively over for Greece. So, he ingeniously devised a loophole. Leonidas framed his departure not as a full army deployment, but as an advance guard or a personal bodyguard mission. He carefully selected 300 men who already had living sons, ensuring their family lines would not abruptly end if they perished. But Leonidas was a pragmatist, a seasoned warrior, not a fool. He knew 300 men were tactically useless on their own. They were a potent symbol, a diplomatic token to show the rest of Greece that Sparta was truly committed. To actually hold the pass, he needed muscle. He needed the Arcadians. The negotiation that followed was less of a diplomatic summit and more of a tense standoff. Messengers were dispatched into the Arcadian highlands with a challenge. The Spartans essentially declared, "Our king is marching to die for Greece. Are the sons of the bear brave enough to follow, or will you hide in your caves?" It was a masterstroke of emotional manipulation. The Arcadians, particularly the proud warrior castes of Tegea and Mantinea, could not allow their rivals to perceive them as cowards. Nor could they let Sparta claim sole guardianship of the Peloponnese. Yet, the decision to join was fraught with deep suspicion. The Arcadians knew intimately how Sparta operated. They had been on the receiving end of Spartan aggression for generations. They suspected that Leonidas might use them as a buffer, a fleshy wall to preserve his precious Spartan citizens. This fear was not unfounded. In Greek warfare, allies were often strategically placed on the flanks or in vulnerable positions while the elite troops held the safest spots. Despite the ingrained mistrust, the sheer magnitude of the Persian threat forced their hand. The councils of Tegea, Mantinea, or Orchomenus, and the smaller Arcadian towns collectively voted to mobilize. They did not send their entire armies, as it was harvest season and they too had their own festivals, but they sent their best, their most formidable warriors. The mustering must have been an incredible sight to behold. Imagine the scene as the columns converged. From the south came the Spartans, moving with that terrifying, rhythmic uniformity, their bronze shields polished to a mirror sheen, crimson cloaks identical. Then, pouring down from the mountain tracks came the Arcadians. They were louder, less uniform, a vibrant sea of different crests and shield patterns. There was likely no warm embrace or joyous reunion. These men were neighbors, but they were certainly not friends. The Spartans looked down on the Arcadians as uncouth hillbillies, rough and unrefined. The Arcadians looked at the Spartans as arrogant oppressors, haughty and self-serving. But as they looked north toward the looming, unimaginable threat of Xerxes, those ingrained differences had to be shelved, at least temporarily. Leonidas took command of this mixed, disparate force. His towering presence was the crucial glue. For the Arcadians, serving under a Spartan king gave the mission a vital legitimacy. It signaled that this was not a mere suicide run. Or so they desperately hoped. Kings do not usually throw their lives away recklessly. They assumed there was a grand plan, a reinforcement army coming behind them. They did not know that Leonidas had likely already accepted his own death. He was leading them into a trap, and he had not told them the full, terrifying extent of the danger. The coalition that marched north was a fragile organism. It consisted of roughly 7,000 men in total. The Arcadians, with their sheer numbers and physical prowess, formed the very spine of this beast. As they marched through Boeotia and towards the Malian Gulf, the grim reality of their situation began to sink in. They were leaving the relative safety of their mountains for a narrow, exposed strip of coastland. They were entrusting their lives to a king who had, perhaps ominously, brought his own burial shroud in the form of a crimson cloak. The alliance itself was almost impossible because it defied the natural political gravity of ancient Greece. City-states were fiercely independent, often preferring to die alone than fight together under another's command. That they marched at all is a testament to the sheer terror Xerxes inspired. As they approached the hot gates, the heavy smell of sulfur from the thermal springs drifted on the wind, mixing with the sharp salt air. The Arcadians instinctively tightened their grips on their spears. They had left their farms, their herds, and their beloved families to stand on a foreign beach. They were about to find out if the Spartans were as good as they claimed, and if the Proselynes could indeed stop the sun from rising in the east. History often glosses over the brutal physical reality of moving an army. Maps show arrows sweeping effortlessly across terrain. But for the men on the ground, the march north was a grueling endurance test that mercilessly separated the seasoned soldiers from the inexperienced civilians. The distance from the gathering point at the isthmus to the pass at Thermopylae is roughly 200 kilometers. For a modern vehicle, this is a simple morning drive. For men carrying 70 pounds of bronze, wood, and leather under the baking Greek sun, it was a slow, grinding torture. This march serves as our first real window into the logistics of the ancient army and the stark, palpable contrast between the allies. As the column snaked its way through the mountains of Boeotia, the profound difference between the Spartans and the Arcadians became visibly, painfully obvious. The Spartans marched with a terrifying, rhythmic silence. Their equipment was standardized, meticulously maintained by state slaves who accompanied the baggage train. Every Spartan shield was polished to a mirror finish. Every crimson cloak was dyed to the same deep hue. They moved like a single, terrifying organism, a machine built solely for war. Then came the Arcadians. Their column was a riot of color and noise. Because they were citizen militias and mercenaries who supplied their own gear, there was absolutely no uniformity. A wealthy Mantinean noble might stride forward in a full bronze muscle cuirass that rivaled any Spartan's, while the man next to him, a goat herder from a remote mountain village, might wear a stiffened linen corselet, the linothorax, or perhaps just a thick leather tunic. The great equalizer, however, was the aspes, the 3-foot-wide shield that defined their class and their role. Whether bronze-faced or simple ox-hide, the shield forced absolute cooperation. In the phalanx, your shield covered your left side and the right side of the man next to you. This meant that a Spartan aristocrat might find his very life depending on the coverage provided by a Tegean farmer's battered shield. The march forced these men into an uncomfortable intimacy. They breathed the same dust. They drank from the same muddy streams. The friction between the groups likely peaked when they made camp. The Spartans messed in their exclusive groups, eating their infamous black broth, a mixture of pork, blood, and vinegar, which they stoically claimed gave them their strength. The Arcadians, accustomed to the hearty, scavenger diet of the highlands, roasted whatever meat they could hunt or buy, likely mocking the Spartans' bland, unappetizing slurry. These cultural clashes were not trivial. They profoundly underscored the inherent fragility of the alliance. The Arcadians were loud, boisterous, and emotional. The Spartans were cold, detached, and imbued with an air of superiority. As they neared the Malian Gulf, the geography began to tighten dramatically. The mountains of the Trachinian cliffs squeezed ever closer to the sea, funneling the army toward their fated destination. When they finally arrived at Thermopylae, the grim reality of the fortress must have been a shock. We tend to imagine Thermopylae as a ready-made castle waiting to be defended. It was nothing of the sort. The middle gate, the narrowest point of the pass, was marked only by the crumbling ruins of an ancient wall built centuries earlier by the Phocians to keep out the Thessalian raiders. It was a decaying pile of limestone overgrown with weeds, hardly a formidable barrier for the greatest army on earth. This is where the class divide explicitly manifested in labor. The wall had to be rebuilt, and it had to be done immediately and efficiently. While Leonidas and his officers meticulously surveyed the terrain and planned their kill zones, the heavy lifting fell squarely to the rank and file. One can easily picture the scene: Arcadian strongmen, their muscles hardened by years of stonemasonry and forestry, hauling the massive limestone blocks into place, sweating and cursing, while the Spartans stood guard, stoically supervising the effort. The resentment must have been palpable. The acorn eaters were building the very cage that they would all soon be trapped in. Yet this arduous labor served a crucial purpose. It gave the men a tangible, physical stake in the ground. They were not just defending a map coordinate. They were defending a wall they had literally built with their own hands. By the time the mortar was drying, the Phocian wall stood roughly 6 feet high, just tall enough to effectively break a cavalry charge, and just low enough to fight over fiercely with a spear. Then, inevitably, the enemy arrived. The arrival of the Persian vanguard was a psychological sledgehammer. We rely on Herodotus for the numbers, but modern historians estimate the Persian land force was likely between 100,000 and 300,000 combatants, supported by a vast fleet of over 1,000 ships. Even the most conservative estimates represent a force larger than the entire population of many Greek city-states combined. For the Arcadians, men who had spent their lives in the enclosed valleys of the Peloponnese, the sight was utterly incomprehensible. The Persian camp did not just occupy the plain of Trachis. It consumed it entirely. At night, the myriad campfires of Xerxes' army looked like a shimmering reflection of the starry sky, stretching unbroken from the mountains to the distant horizon. The incessant noise of their camp, the braying of camels, the clatter of foreign tongues, the sheer hum of teeming humanity, drifted eerily across the silent Greek lines. It was here that the famous Scout incident occurred, though we must view it through a wider, more nuanced lens. A Persian scout rode boldly up to the Greek lines to assess their strength. He reported back to Xerxes that he saw a small group of men exercising and meticulously combing their long hair. Xerxes famously laughed, thinking the Greeks were merely pining for a festival or some trivial activity. But the scout only saw the Spartans, who were conspicuously camped in front of the wall. What the scout critically missed, and what Xerxes utterly failed to calculate, was the thousands of Arcadians and other allies camped strategically behind the wall. The Arcadians were not combing their hair. They were sharpening their iron coppice blades. They were meticulously checking the straps of their shields. They were praying earnestly to Pan, asking for the strength to sow utter chaos. This intelligence failure was absolutely critical. Xerxes assumed he was facing a tiny, vain suicide squad. He did not know he was walking into a brutal meat grinder manned by 7,000 desperate, heavy infantry. The Arcadians remained the hidden variable in the equation, the submerged bulk of the iceberg. The atmosphere in the Greek camp on the eve of battle was a potent mixture of profound dread and defiant bravado. Leonidas held a final, solemn war council. The tactical plan was elegantly simple: the narrow pass negated the overwhelming Persian numerical advantage. If the Greeks could hold the line and force the Persians into a frontal assault, the superior Greek armor and the longer reach of their spears would slaughter the lightly armored eastern troops. But there was a terrifying catch. The Greeks knew they were deeply vulnerable to being flanked. They knew about the treacherous mountain paths. The survival of the entire army depended precariously on the Persians being arrogant enough to attack head-on. As the sun began to rise on the first day, the Arcadians took their positions. They were not placed in the rear. Due to the rotation system Leonidas implemented to keep troops fresh, Arcadian contingents would be on the front line for significant portions of the fighting. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable wall of bronze and oak. The heat began to rise oppressively. The sulphurous steam from the springs swirled around their ankles and across the plain. The ominous sound of war drums began to beat. The agonizing waiting was over. The Proselynes were about to meet the Immortals. The sun rose over the Malian Gulf, baking the salt flats and heating the bronze armor of the Greeks until it felt like wearing a searing oven. Xerxes had patiently waited 4 days, expecting the coalition to disintegrate from sheer fear. He assumed the acorn eaters and the pampered Spartans would turn on each other or flee at the sight of his overwhelming numbers. He was wrong. On the 5th day, his patience finally ran out. Xerxes ordered the assault. He did not send his elite immortals first. He sent the Medes and Scythians. These were brave men, but tactically, they were walking into a buzzsaw. To truly understand the slaughter that followed, we have to dissect the hoplite phalanx formation. Pop culture often depicts ancient battles as a series of heroic one-on-one duels where ample space opens up for warriors to spin and slash dramatically. The reality was claustrophobic terror. A phalanx is a solid wall of overlapping shields presenting a bristling hedge of spear points to the enemy. It operates on the fundamental principle of density. The men in the front rank are not fighting alone. They are being physically pinned in place by the surging men behind them. When the Medes charged, they were not running into individual soldiers. They were running into a relentless, terrifying machine. The collision sounded like a catastrophic car crash. Bronze smashing against wicker, wood snapping, men grunting as the breath was brutally knocked out of thousands of lungs simultaneously. The Persians carried shorter spears and wicker shields, designed for mobility and cavalry support, not for grinding, static warfare. Against the heavy Greek dory, an 8-foot spear tipped with iron and counterbalanced with a bronze lizard killer spike, the Medes were hopelessly outmatched. The Spartans took the first shift. They fought with a chilling, robotic efficiency, stabbing over their shields, aiming precisely for eyes and throats, the only vulnerable points on the Persian face. But humans are not machines. Even a Spartan arm tires after thrusting an 8-pound spear repeatedly. Muscles burn, hydration levels drop, and mental fatigue inexorably sets in. This is where the movie 300 fundamentally fails you. It suggests the Spartans fought alone while the Arcadians idly watched. In reality, Leonidas employed a strict rotation system. As the Spartan line began to slow, a sharp whistle or trumpet blast would sound. The Spartans would perform a complex maneuver, opening their files to retreat, while the next contingent stepped forward to plug the gaps. Tegeans, Mantineans, forward! Now the Persians were not facing the silent, disciplined Spartans. They were facing the bear. The Arcadians slammed into the line with a distinctly different kind of energy. If the Spartans were surgically precise, the Arcadians were brutally savage. These were men who hunted wild boar with javelins. They brought a raw, guttural aggression to the combat, an untamed fury. The men of Tegea, fueled by their intense rivalry, competed fiercely to see who could drop more Medes. The Mantineans, refusing to be outdone, pushed the line forward with reckless, unstoppable force. The killing zone quickly became a slippery, gruesome mess of mud and blood. The Greeks had a grim advantage. Their shields covered them effectively from chin to knee. The Persians, lacking heavy armor, had no way to push back without impaling themselves on the deadly spear points. The Arcadian spears acted like pistons, stabbing out from behind the wall of shields, retracting, and stabbing again. It was rhythmic, industrial slaughter. For the Arcadian farmers, This was a profound revelation. They realized, with chilling clarity, that the masters of the world bled just like anyone else. The myth of Persian invincibility shattered against their unyielding shields. The acorn eaters found that their lifelong diet of hardship and struggle had prepared them perfectly for this brutal moment. They did not tire as quickly as the city-bred troops. Their mountain lungs processed the dust-choked air efficiently, enduring where others faltered. As the day wore on, the pile of Persian dead began to create a significant tactical problem. It was not just a few bodies, it was a rampart of corpses. The Arcadians had to step up onto the bodies of the men they had just killed to maintain the shield wall. The fighting surface became unstable, shifting perilously underfoot with the slickness of gore. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne on a nearby hill, reportedly jumped up 3 times in terror. He was not fearing for his own life. He was watching his vast army evaporate before his very eyes. He saw his Medes, proud warriors who had conquered Assyria and Egypt, being fed into a grinder operated by men he considered mere barbarians. The Arcadians held their ground for hours. They took wounds, certainly. Persian arrows fell like relentless rain, finding gaps in armor, piercing necks and thighs. But the phalanx did not break. The fierce rivalry between Tegea and Mantinea actually strengthened the line, transforming it into an unbreakable bond. Neither city would be the first to step back. They locked their shields together, creating a bronze dam that held back the overwhelming Persian flood. By late afternoon, the Medes retreated, battered, and utterly broken. But the respite was short-lived. Xerxes played his trump card. He signaled for the Immortals, the 10,000 elite shock troops, silent, masked, and heavily armed. The Arcadians, panting, sweating, covered in the filth of war, likely looked at the advancing Immortals with a mixture of dread and dark humor. They were utterly exhausted. Their spears were splintered. But as they rotated back to let the Spartans or another ally take the front, they knew they had done the impossible. They had stopped the unstoppable. The first day ended not with a singular Spartan victory, but with a hard-won Greek coalition victory. The Proselynes had proven, unequivocally, that they belonged on the same stage as the legendary sons of Heracles. But night was falling, and with it came the chilling realization that this was only the beginning. The adrenaline would fade, the wounds would stiffen, and the true horror of the hot gates was yet to come. If the first day was fueled by raw adrenaline, the second day was fueled by sheer horror. By the morning of the second day, the geography of Thermopylae had fundamentally changed. The narrow pass was no longer paved with dirt and grass. It was paved with meat. Thousands of Persian bodies lay bloating hideously in the height of the Greek summer heat. The ancient combat reality is that the greatest enemy often was not the opposing soldier, but the environment itself. The unbearable stench of decay mixed with the coppery tang of blood and the sulfur from the hot springs created a miasma so thick it could make a veteran wretch. Flies arrived in clouds, literally blackening the air. For the Arcadians, men who lived close to the earth and its harsh cycles, this was a grimly familiar cycle of nature, but magnified to an industrial, apocalyptic scale. They wrapped scraps of linen around their faces to filter the noxious air, their eyes stinging from the sweat and gore. Xerxes, seething on his throne, simply could not understand it. He had thrown wave after wave of his subjects at the wall, and the wall had not moved an inch. He assumed the Greeks were utterly exhausted, broken by the sheer trauma of the slaughter. He was partially right about the exhaustion, but he gravely underestimated their resolve. He ordered the Immortals to resume the attack. The Immortals were the stuff of nightmares, 10,000 strong. They wore masks or cloth wrappings that hid their faces, stripping away their humanity, making them seem ethereal. They moved in eerie silence. To the superstitious Arcadian Highlanders, these were not men, they were spirits of the underworld. But when the lines crashed together again, the Arcadians discovered a comforting, brutal truth: spirits do not bleed, but Immortals do. This second confrontation is where the acorn eaters truly earn their indelible place in military history. The Spartans fought with a rhythmic, almost trance-like discipline. The Arcadians fought with a jagged, furious energy. When their spears shattered, and they did shatter, snapping like twigs against Persian wicker, the Arcadians did not retreat. They drew their short swords or their heavy curved blades, typically used for butchering meat, and turned the phalanx into a savage street brawl. There are accounts of Greeks using their teeth, their bare hands, even rocks when their weapons failed. This primal style of fighting suited the Arcadians perfectly. They were wrestlers, experienced hunters who knew intimately how to grapple with a struggling, desperate animal. In the brutal crush of the second day, refined technique mattered less than the sheer will of violence. The Tygians and Mantineans, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans, butchered the Immortals. They pulled them into the shield wall and stabbed them repeatedly in the guts, effectively demystifying the elite Persian guard. But something else was profoundly happening behind the Greek lines. A psychological shift that is rarely discussed. The rigid class barriers were slowly but surely dissolving. On the march north, the Spartans had looked at the Arcadians with disdain. The Arcadians had viewed the Spartans with envy and suspicion. But after 24 hours of standing in the same blood, those brittle social constructs evaporated. You cannot look down on a man who just saved your life from certain death. You cannot envy a man who is vomiting from exhaustion just like you are. We can imagine a powerful moment during a lull in the fighting, a Spartan peer, his crimson cloak stained black with gore, passing a water skin to a Mantinean farmer. No words needed to be spoken. The shared trauma forged a bond stronger than any treaty or political alliance. The impossible alliance had, against all odds, become a brotherhood of the doomed. The Arcadians were no longer just allies or expendable mercenaries. They were brothers in arms, bound by fire and blood. They had seen the Spartans bleed, and the Spartans had seen the Arcadians kill with untamed fury. The respect was mutual, and it was absolute. Xerxes was rapidly running out of options. His vast army was demoralized, on the verge of breaking. The sight of the Immortals retreating, the best soldiers in Asia beaten back by a ragtag coalition of Greeks, sent a ripple of profound panic through the Persian ranks. Officers had to resort to using whips to drive their men toward the Greek spears. To the Greeks, it seemed they might actually win, or at least hold indefinitely. The morale in the camp on the evening of the second day was surprisingly high. They were tired, wounded, and filthy, but they were alive. They had held the gate against the world's greatest army. The Arcadians cleaned their weapons, ate their meager rations, and perhaps, for a fleeting moment, dared to hope. They did not know that the game was rigged. While they were celebrating their survival, a local Malian shepherd named Ephialtes was walking toward the Persian camp. He was not carrying a weapon. He was carrying a secret, a map of the goat paths that crisscrossed the treacherous mountains above them. The true tragedy of the Arcadians is not that they failed to fight or showed cowardice. It is that their valor was rendered meaningless by an act of insidious treachery. They had defeated the Persian army on the field, only to be defeated by a handshake in the dark. As night fell on the second day, the Arcadians slept the deep sleep of the utterly exhausted, unaware that the chilling shadow of betrayal was already moving through the ancient oak forest they loved so much, coming to encircle them. The Anopaia path was open, and the end was relentlessly marching down it. While the Arcadians and Spartans slept the heavy sleep of the victorious, the ultimate fate of Greece was being sold for a mere bag of gold. The betrayal did not happen on the bloody battlefield. It happened silently in the tent of Xerxes. Ephialtes was not a soldier or a man of consequence. He was a nobody, a simple man who knew the intricate shape of the mountains better than he knew the concept of honor or loyalty. He offered Xerxes the one thing his army of millions could not buy, a back door. This back door was the treacherous Anopaia path. To truly understand the magnitude of this impending disaster, we must look closely at the geography. The hot gates were a choke point, yes, but they were not a literal tunnel. Above the cliffs that bordered the pass, there was a hidden goat track. It was narrow, steep, and choked with dense oak forests, winding precariously through the ridges of Mount Calidromus. It was invisible from the coast, a secret known only to locals. Leonidas was not a fool. He knew about the path. In a prudent strategic move, he had stationed 1,000 Phocian hoplites up on the mountain to guard this specific, vital route. He believed the flank was secure, impervious. But history often turns on the smallest, most unexpected hinges. Under the cover of a moonless night, the Immortals, led by their commander Hydarnes, began the arduous ascent. They moved with the silence of assassins, their armor muffled, climbing the rugged spine of the mountain, while the Greek camp below remained utterly oblivious. At dawn, they reached the summit. The Phocians, hearing the distinct rustle of thousands of feet in the dry leaves, scrambled hastily to arms. This was the pivotal moment that decided the war. If the Phocians had held their ground, if they had effectively blocked the narrow track, the Immortals would have been bottled up, their flanking maneuver thwarted. But the Phocians made a strategic failure of catastrophic proportions. Seeing the massive Persian force, the Phocians mistakenly assumed they were the primary target. Panic took the wheel. Instead of holding the choke point, they retreated to a nearby hill to make a defensive stand, preparing to die valiantly. Hydarnes must have simply laughed. He did not care about the Phocians. He ignored them completely, bypassing their confused line entirely. He simply marched his men past the confused Phocian line and began the rapid descent toward the rear of Leonidas's position. The door was not just unlocked, it had been left wide open. Back at the coast, the first warning signs came with the morning light. Lookouts spotted the glint of armor moving unmistakably down the mountain side behind them. The chilling realization hit the camp like a physical blow. The impossible had happened. They were flanked. The reaction within the Greek camp was chaos, verging on pandemonium. The Arcadians, who had spent 2 days fighting tooth and nail, realized that their tactical victory was evaporating before their eyes. The wall they had so valiantly defended was now a tomb. The phalanx is a directional weapon. It is fundamentally designed to face forward. It cannot effectively fight an enemy coming from behind. Leonidas called a final council of war. This was not a debate about tactics or strategy. It was a harrowing debate about sheer survival. The captains of the various city-states were shouting, arguing fiercely, pointing fingers. The overarching sentiment was raw panic. Why stay? To stay was certain suicide. For the Arcadians, the situation was particularly bitter, a cruel twist of fate. They had done everything asked of them. They had bled profusely. They had held the line against overwhelming odds. They had proven their worth beyond any doubt. Now, because of a catastrophic failure by the Phocians up on the mountain, they were hopelessly trapped. This moment profoundly defines the leadership of Leonidas. He did not simply order a mass suicide. He understood with brutal clarity that the Greek coalition was the only army standing between Xerxes and the rest of Greece. If the entire force of 7,000 men died here today, there would be no one left to defend the isthmus, no one to fight at Plataea. So he made a monumental decision that has been misinterpreted for millennia. He did not just decide to stay. He decided to dismiss the bulk of the army. This was not an act of vain martyrdom. It was a cold, calculated tactical sacrifice. Someone had to stay behind to hold the pass, to delay the swift Persian cavalry long enough for the rest of the army to escape. If everyone ran at once, the Persian cavalry would relentlessly run them down on the open plains. A rear guard was absolutely necessary. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The Arcadians looked at the Spartans. The Spartans looked at the Arcadians. The impossible alliance was about to be irrevocably severed. The Tegeans and Mantineans, proud men of the Bear, had to make an agonizing choice. Disobey the order and die in a hopeless, unwinnable battle, or obey, retreat, and live with the profound shame of leaving their commander behind. It is here that the popular narrative usually cuts to black for the Allies. History books often state that the Allies simply departed as if they merely packed their bags and went on a leisurely holiday. But imagine the raw emotion of that departure. These men had bonded in blood. Now they were being told to walk away while their newfound friends prepared to die a horrific death. But not everyone left. And this is the crucial detail that truly disrupts the 300 myth. While the majority of the Arcadians were ordered to retreat to save manpower for the future defense of the Peloponnese, a significant number of other Greeks defiantly refused to leave. The Thespians stayed. The Thebans stayed. And most importantly for our story, the enduring memory of the Arcadians stayed. As the main Arcadian columns formed up to march south, not in panicked flight, but in a disciplined, strategic retreat, they must have looked back at the Phocian wall. They saw the 300 Spartans preparing for their final, desperate stand. They saw the 700 Thespians, who are truly the unsung heroes of this unsung story, steadfastly refusing to budge. The Arcadians walked away with a heavy, profound burden. They carried the guilt of the survivor. They knew that by the time they reached safety, every man they left behind would be dead. This survivor's guilt would become the potent fuel that powered their rage in the years to come. They were not running away in cowardice. They were merely reloading, preparing for the next engagement. The order to retreat is often far harder to obey than the order to charge headlong into battle. On that final, fateful morning, the atmosphere within the Phocian wall was not filled with the chaotic panic of a rout. It was heavy with the suffocating weight of duty and sacrifice. Leonidas stood before the coalition. The scouts had confirmed the complete encirclement. The Immortals were mere hours away from closing the inescapable trap. The king of Sparta knew that if the entire army remained, the resistance of Greece would definitively end that very afternoon. 7,000 men would be slaughtered in a pocket, leaving the road to Athens and the Peloponnese wide open, undefended. So Leonidas' last order was issued. It was a command of dismissal. He told the allies to leave. He told them to take their weapons, their strength, and their burning anger back south. They were desperately needed to defend the isthmus. They were the seed corn for the next harvest of war, and they could not be ground up here. For the Arcadians, this command was a bitter pill to swallow. These were men who had built their formidable reputation on stubbornness and tenacity. To walk away from a fight was utterly antithetical to their culture. To walk away from this fight, leaving the Spartans behind, felt like a profound betrayal of the brotherhood they had forged over the last 2 brutal days. We must visualize this agonizing separation. It was not a quick or clean break. The columns formed up. The Tygians and Mantineans, likely looking at their Spartan counterparts with a mixture of awe and devastation, began the arduous march south. They were leaving the hot gates not as victors, but as survivors, burdened by their decision. But the history books often simplify this poignant moment into the Spartans stayed. Everyone else ran. This is a blatant fabrication. The breakdown of precisely who stayed and who left reveals the true complexity of the choice. Leonidas stayed with his 300, but he was not alone. The 700 Thespians, led by their brave general, Demophilus, defiantly refused the order to leave. They chose, of their own free will, to stay and die, an act of voluntary sacrifice that rivals and perhaps even exceeds that of the Spartans, who were, after all, bound by law to stay. As the 2,000 Arcadians marched out of the pass, the sound of their departure must have been hauntingly resonant. The rhythmic thud of thousands of feet moving away from the enemy. Every step took them closer to safety and further from a glorious, if doomed, honor. They had to listen to the silence of the men left behind, a silence that would soon be broken by battle cries and the clash of steel. They knew that within hours, the men they had shared bread and water with, the men they had fought alongside, would be dead. This retreat birthed a profound psychological scar. The march back to the Peloponnese was a funeral procession for their pride, a journey steeped in sorrow. When they arrived back in Tegea and Mantinea, how were they received? They were alive, yes. They brought their shields back, technically fulfilling the hoplite code, but the context felt hollow, tainted by the circumstances. They had to look into the eyes of their wives and children and explain that the king was dead, the pass had fallen, and they, the men of the Bear, had walked away. The proselytes found themselves in a purgatory of reputation, their valor questioned. The story of the 300 began to spread almost immediately, meticulously engineered by the Spartan survivors and the poets. The narrative quickly solidified: Sparta gave everything. The allies gave up. The Arcadians were systematically erased from the hero's edit, their contributions overlooked. But this shame, ironically, served a potent purpose. It acted as a compression chamber for their burgeoning rage. The Arcadians did not dissolve into pacifism or despair. They went home and sharpened their spears again, their resolve hardened. They understood something that the poets, focused on poetic glory, often missed. Leonidas did not send them home to retire or live out their days in peace. He sent them home to prepare. The very survival of the Arcadians at Thermopylae was the only reason a substantial Greek army existed to fight later. If 7,000 Greeks had all stayed and died, Xerxes would have rolled over the rest of the peninsula with terrifying ease. The Arcadian retreat was the ultimate act of discipline, a suppression of the ego's desire for a glorious death in favor of the strategic necessity of a future victory. They carried the memory of the hot gates with them like a burning, unforgiving coal. They remembered the arrogance of the Immortals. They remembered the face of Ephialtes, the betrayer. And most of all, they remembered the sacrifice of the Thespians and Spartans. They owed a blood debt. And in the ancient world, blood debts were always, inexorably paid. As the seasons turned and the formidable Persian army ravaged Athens, burning the Acropolis to the ground, the Arcadians patiently waited in their mountains. They were no longer mere mercenaries looking for a paycheck. They were a sharpened weapon, waiting to be unleashed. The time for dying beautifully had passed. The time for killing effectively was fast approaching. Thermopylae was the tragedy. The next chapter would be the reckoning. 1 year later, the summer of 479 BC. The setting shifts dramatically from the narrow cliffs of the hot gates to the rolling plains of Plataea. Here, the final fate of the Western world would be decisively decided. If Thermopylae was a skirmish, this was Armageddon, a clash of civilizations. The Greek coalition had assembled the largest hoplite army ever seen, nearly 40,000 heavy infantry with a total force strength approaching 110,000 men. Among them stood the hardened survivors of Thermopylae, the men of Arcadia, burning with a year's worth of accumulated shame and furious indignation. This monumental battle offers the perfect counterpoint to the myth of Spartan supremacy. At Plataea, the acorn eaters did not just support the Spartans, they spectacularly outperformed them. Before the first spear was thrown, a heated diplomatic incident occurred that tells us everything we need to know about the Arcadian mindset. The Tegeans, the fiercest of the Arcadian contingent, boldly demanded the place of honor on the left wing of the army. They argued fiercely with the Athenians, citing ancient deeds and mythological victories. They were not acting like a defeated or humble people. They were acting like apex predators demanding the best seat at the feast. They eventually conceded the left wing to Athens, taking their place next to the Spartans on the right. But the powerful message was sent. The bear was awake, and it was hungry, ravenous for vengeance. The Battle of Plataea began in chaos. For days, the two massive armies danced around each other, plagued by severe supply issues and debilitating thirst. Mardonius, the Persian general left behind by Xerxes, unleashed his formidable cavalry to harass the Greeks. It was a miserable, dusty stalemate, a war of attrition. Then came the breaking point. The Spartans and Tegeans found themselves isolated on a ridge, facing the main body of the Persian army. The Persian infantry planted their shields firmly in the ground, forming a barricade, and unleashed a storm of arrows so thick it literally darkened the sky. Here, history records a moment of excruciating tension. Pausanias, the Spartan regent, stubbornly refused to give the orders to charge. He was stuck in a religious loop, sacrificing goat after goat, anxiously waiting for favorable omens from the gods. Meanwhile, the men were dying, arrows raining down relentlessly on the crouching hoplites. The Tegeans had had enough. While the Spartans prayed, the Tegeans acted decisively. In a display of raw, insubordinate courage that defied all orders, the Tegeans rose from behind their shields. They did not care about the omens. They cared profoundly about the blood debt they owed to Leonidas and the men left at Thermopylae. With a roar that must have echoed off the ghostly peaks of Thermopylae, they charged the Persian line first, a wave of unstoppable fury. Seeing their allies surge forward with such ferocity, the Spartans finally dropped their religious scruples and joined the rush. But make no mistake, the Arcadians initiated the contact, they broke the stalemate. The collision was catastrophic for the Persians. The heavy Greek hoplite phalanx smashed through the wicker shield wall like a sledgehammer through brittle glass. The pent-up aggression of the Tegeans was unleashed in a frenzy of close-quarters violence. They were not fighting for strategy anymore. They were fighting for catharsis, for brutal vengeance. Every Persian they cut down was a payment, a gruesome installment for the friends they had left at the hot gates. The battle quickly turned into an utter rout. Mardonius was killed, a brick thrown by a Spartan crushing his skull, abruptly ending the invasion's leadership. The leaderless Persian mob fled back to their fortified wooden stockade. And this is where the Arcadians delivered their final, undeniable statement of prowess. The Spartans, for all their legendary prowess in open battle, were notoriously inept at siege warfare. They reached the Persian stockade and stalled, unable to breach the formidable walls. They hacked uselessly at the timber, making no headway. Then the Tegeans arrived. The men of the mountains, accustomed to rough terrain and arduous manual labor, tore into the fortifications with primal ferocity. Herodotus explicitly credits the Tegeans with bursting open the gate. They shattered the wood, creating the crucial breach that allowed the flood of Greek rage to pour inside. What followed inside that stockade was not a battle. It was a brutal, merciless extermination, Greek victory over Persia in its most brutal form. The Greeks, fueled by the searing memory of Athens burning and Thermopylae falling, showed no mercy whatsoever. Of the hundreds of thousands of Persians who supposedly started the campaign, only a tiny fraction escaped alive. The Tegeans stood amidst the carnage, covered in gore, breathing the heavy air of victory. They had done it. They had returned to the field, faced the same enemy, and this time they did not have to walk away in shame. They had broken the wall that the mighty Spartans could not break. In the aftermath, the Greeks erected a magnificent serpent column at Delphi to commemorate the victory. On its bronze coils, the names of the city-states were inscribed for all time. Tegea, Mantinea, and Orchomenus are there, proudly etched alongside Sparta and Athens. They earned that engraving with iron and blood, with every drop of their sacrifice. Redemption was complete. The restless ghosts of the 300, the 700 Thespians, and the forgotten Arcadians who died at the hot gates could finally rest in peace. The acorn eaters had proven that they were not just filler in a glorified Spartan story. They were the hammer that crushed the Persian invasion, the true backbone of the resistance. So we return to the fundamental question that started this entire journey. If the Arcadians fought so bravely, if they provided the mass that held the line at Thermopylae and the visceral rage that broke the wall at Plataea, why do we only remember the 300? The answer lies in the potent concept of historical memory. History is not a neutral recording of everything that happened. It is, more accurately, a recording of what people chose to remember and how they chose to present it. And in the ancient world, nobody curated their own brand better than the Spartans. Sparta was perhaps the first state to cleverly weaponize silence as a marketing tool. They famously practiced laconicism, the art of speaking in short, pithy, memorable one-liners. When asked to surrender their arms, Leonidas did not send a diplomatic letter explaining the intricate socio-political reasons for his refusal. He reportedly said, "Mollen Labe, come and take them." It was a powerful soundbite designed to echo through the ages, eternally. The Arcadians, by stark contrast, were not poets or philosophers. They were acorn eaters, rough and practical. They did not leave behind a repository of witty quotes or philosophical treatises. They left behind dented shields and broken spears, artifacts that do not translate well into oral tradition or poetic verse. Furthermore, Spartan propaganda was incredibly effective and pervasive. After the war, Sparta expertly used the legend of Thermopylae to justify their dominance over the rest of Greece. They spun a compelling narrative that they alone had heroically saved civilization from ruin. The death of Leonidas became a political currency that bought them deference and influence for decades. Admitting that they desperately needed the help of thousands of rough hillbillies to hold the pass would have significantly devalued their carefully crafted brand of superhuman superiority. So they simply omitted the inconvenient details, whitewashing history. This distortion was cemented by later historians and artists. From Herodotus, who actually tried to be fair but was ultimately seduced by the Spartan mystique. To modern graphic novels and blockbuster films, the lens has always focused almost exclusively on the Crimson Cloak. It is cleaner, simpler, and more cinematic to tell a story about a few perfect heroes than a messy, multicultural army of thousands. But this erasure has profound consequences. When we ignore the Arcadians, we inadvertently endorse a dangerous fallacy, the great man theory. We begin to believe that history is shaped only by kings and elites, while the common people are just background scenery, inconsequential. The reality of Thermopylae is far more inspiring and complex than the myth. It is the story of a coalition. It is the story of the Tegeans and Mantineans who, against their ingrained hatreds, put aside their differences for the greater good. It is the story of the Thespians who stayed to die when they absolutely did not have to, a pure act of selflessness. It is the story of the vast, silent majority who did the heavy lifting, built the walls, and took the arrows, so that the stars of Western civilization could continue to shine. The Arcadians at Thermopylae represent the unsung, essential workers of history. They are the ones who show up, do the dirty, brutal work, and go home without a parade or recognition. They remind us, powerfully, that courage is not the monopoly of the famous or the elite. Today, if you go to Thermopylae, you will see a massive statue of Leonidas. It is the undeniable center of attention. But if you look nearby, there is a modest monument to the Thespians, a statue of a soldier, headless and tragic. And if you look even harder into the dust and the rocks of the pass itself, you might still feel the lingering presence of the others. We cannot build a statue for every Arcadian who died there. We do not even know most of their names. But we can offer them something far better, the truth. We can correct the historical record. We can say clearly and loudly that the 300 were never alone. They stood, anchored and supported, on the broad shoulders of the bear. As we close this chapter, I want you to think about the other Arcadians in history, the groups, the units, the people who have been edited out of the textbooks because their story was not cinematic enough, not easily packaged. Who else are we forgetting, whose contributions remain obscured? History is a vast, dark room. We've only been pointing our flashlight at the spots where the gold glitters enticingly. It is time we started shining it into the hidden corners where the iron lies rusting, waiting to be rediscovered. If you believe that these forgotten stories deserve to be told, you know what to do. Share this video to help rewrite the algorithm of history, to bring these truths to light. And if you want to dive even deeper into the dark side of the ancient world, specifically the brutal secret police of Sparta known as the Cryptia, click the video appearing on your screen now. The Spartans were not just heroes, they were also, at times, monsters. And that is a story you absolutely need to hear.